Well, welcome to the last of our pre-recorded sermons. From Sunday, the 5th of July, we'll be meeting together on site. A reminder that we'll be doing 2 services to begin with, and we'll check out how that runs and the logistics around that, and then work out where we go from there. You'll need to book in, so please keep an eye out for the emails and on the website and so forth, so that you can learn the information about that. But we're excited to be able to gather together in person on the 5th. If you can't make it on that day, we will also be doing live streaming. But for this morning, for the last of the sermons on video in this format, I encourage you to grab your Bible, turn to Lamentations chapter 3, and let's read together. I have been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendour is gone, and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I remember them well, my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait on him. I don't know how many of you have ever seen either live or in a picture something like the picture that's going up on the screen at the moment of motorbike parking in different parts of the world. When I've been to India, I haven't quite seen it like this, but I've seen it pretty well set out. And can you imagine coming back to this place? Can you imagine what it would be like to come back and go, where did I park my motorbike? You would be walking around literally for days trying to find it. But maybe a little closer to home. Imagine you're in a car park, and maybe it's a car park that you don't use often, and you park your car. And so what you do as you're leaving your car is you take some markers. Okay, I'm on the green level, which is level 4, and I'm near this pillar, or I'm near that, or I'm this direction from the elevators or whatever. In other words, you take some markers so that as you're going to go back there eventually, you've got something to help guide you in that journey. Well, here the writer of Lamentations says that we are to be carriers of hope. But we're not carriers of hope because of what we see with our eyes, and we are not carriers of hope because we are without troubles or difficulties in this world. We are, according to the writer of Lamentations, carriers of hope because of the God that we follow and the promises that he has made to us. But just like parking our car in a car park, we take some markers to help us understand how to get back there. The writer of Lamentations says there are some markers, there are some things to remember, there are some things to call to mind in order to help us be carriers of hope in this world. And we're going to talk about those today. But before we do, the setting is important. The setting helps us understand what was happening for the writer of Lamentations and what is going on in the world around them. Because as we understand the setting, we understand that the writer of Lamentations is not somebody who's kind of sitting up in their ivory tower, everything perfect and life sorted out for them, giving advice to those that are struggling. The writer of Lamentations is actually in the midst of trouble and difficulty. And yet in the midst of trouble and difficulty, he calls some things to mind, and they help him be a carrier of hope. The writer to Lamentations writes somewhere around the mid-550 BC, about 550 years or a bit more either side, before the birth of Jesus. So let's go back before this though for a moment. Abraham is called by God and he starts to gather God's people, but eventually they end up in Egypt around the time of Joseph and become slaves in Egypt. Moses, later on, leads God's people out of Egypt and through the wilderness, and then those that follow him lead God's people into the land that God had promised them. Then in 722 BC, The northern part of the kingdom, what we sometimes call Samaria, is taken captive and taken off into exile. Then in about 589 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon comes down and surrounds Jerusalem and ends up taking the southern kingdom into captivity, and that includes the fall of Jerusalem. And it's in this period of the southern kingdoms being taken into exile that the writer of Lamentation writes. So I want you to imagine for a moment somebody sitting in the dust of ruins, somebody sitting there watching their city burn, their temple ruined, their families taken into exile, and all of that would surround that. Imagine them sitting there with their head in their hands, crying out to God. That's the writer of Lamentations, sitting with his head in his hands, crying out to God. Listen to how he writes about it in Lamentations 3 again. I have been deprived of peace, and I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say my splendour is all gone, and all I'd hoped for from the Lord. I remember my affliction, my wandering, my bitterness, and my gall. I remember them well, and my soul is downcast within me. That's why the book is called the Book of Lamentations, because to lament is what is called a passionate expression of grief or sorrow, to mourn loudly. Now, maybe we could put it in our own words. There's crying and there's ugly crying, isn't there? Imagine crying for a moment. Imagine, you're a guy, you invite a girl out to the movies and she wants to see a rom-com. You want to see a thriller, but she wants to see a rom-com, and you're dating, so you think, no, we'll see the rom-com, and you're a bit bored, but somewhere through it gets you. And you feel the tears start to come down your face, but you don't want to admit that you're crying, and so you might adjust your glasses, and as you adjust your glasses, you kind of clean up, or you pretend to eat some food, and as you put your hand in your mouth, you just kind of wipe it away, because, crying, normal crying in that sort of sense, can be covered up. But ugly crying can't. Ugly crying involves, wailing and making some sounds that you didn't know could come from the depth of your being. They involve maybe some spit or some snot or whatever it happens to be. They involve your eyes going all red because you cannot hide ugly crying. Well, it's as if the writer of Lamentations is ugly crying. Think about it for a moment. Their nation, their faith, their city, their temple, their family is all in ruins. And so they sit there and cry out to God. In fact, the book of Lamentations in Hebrew is sometimes called the book of how, because a number of the laments start with the word how. Like, how, God, could this happen? How is what's happening fair? How are you at work, God? These sorts of questions. It's as if the writer of Lamentations agrees with the psalmist, like Psalm 13, for example, that says, how long, O Lord? You see, the writer of Lamentations sits there saying, how is this happening? And yet the writer of Lamentations comes to a crossroads. In a sense, he says, I look this way, I look to the left, and there's bitterness and gall and anguish, and I'm despair. But I look to the right, I look a different direction, and I call some things to mind, and therefore I have hope. So he can look at his affliction, these bitterness, these troubles, and it causes his soul to go down. Or he can call these other things to mind, and his soul rises in hope. And so what he says then is there are three things that he calls to mind that help him have hope. There are three things that he remembers, that he calls to mind in this moment, and somehow as he calls them to mind, hope starts to rise. And the first thing he calls to mind, is God's great love. Language can be a tricky thing, can't it? I watch some of you for whom English isn't your first language trying to translate something into English, and for a whole bunch of reasons sometimes it's difficult. And one of the reasons it can be difficult is because a word in one language can have multiple meanings in another. I mean, think about it for a moment. This year's theme is light. But we said light really is too simple a word to just be by itself. There's lots of meanings to it. Remember, it's like shining into a prism, a beam, and out the other end comes this myriad of things. So this year we've talked about God is light. God guides and sustains us by his light. We are light. We shine light. Or in this last little bit of the series, we carry light burdens. In other words, one little phrase didn't do it enough justice. We had to kind of broaden it out. But think of the word, say, love for a moment. I love Annette. I love cycling. And I love chicken schnitzel. Now, all of us, and I would suspect Annette specifically, would hope that the way that I love Annette is different to the way that I love chicken schnitzel. Well, let's firstly read what the writer says. He says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. But because love is such a widely used word, I think it's fair to ask the question, what kind of love is this? Is it the deep, profound love of a husband for a wife, or is it a chicken schnitzel kind of love? What sort of is this great love that is talked about by God? Now, the Hebrew word for love in this passage is a word called hesed. Now, I won't try and say it with the guttural sounds that it's meant to. One, because I can't do it very well, and secondly, because I'll spit all over the camera and Pastor Ben doesn't want to clean it up. But hesed is this word that doesn't quite translate easily into English. It's not just love. It's not just one word. It's this complex meaning. It's more like covenantal love, or sacrificial love, or selfless love, or steadfast love. That's why, if you remember, and you're in church, and in certain churches a few years ago at least now, we used to sing that song, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. I know there are some of you that want me to sing it, but I won't. But what I'm trying to say is this love is not just one simple thing, it's this profound, deep love. It's this steadfast, covenantal, sacrificial, selfless. It's that kind of love that God has for us. So the first thing to call to mind is that God's love for you is not fleeting. It isn't based on how well you are doing. God's love isn't based on how faithful you are. God's love isn't based on how sacrificial you are. It isn't based on how steadfast you are. When the writer calls to mind this love of God, what he's saying is this love is not based on those things, because this love is based on how sacrificial God is. It's based on how faithful God is. It's based on how selfless God is. It's based on how steadfast God is. So we call this steadfast love of God, this sacrificial love of God to mind, that is directed towards us and is not dependent on us. So what do we call to mind? What does the writer ask us to call to mind? Well, firstly, the steadfast, sacrificial, covenantal kind of love that God has for you. And even as I say that, I just feel hope rising in me. Secondly, the writer of Lamentations calls us to call to mind God's compassion. I mean, have you ever watched those videos of dogs in trouble? You know, the dog has ripped apart a cushion or a lounge or pulled paper out or whatever it happens to be. And the dog's in trouble, and the owner's saying, come over here, and you watch this dog. He won't look at the owner. He doesn't want to look because he knows he's going to be in trouble. Now, let's be honest. If it was a cat and that cat was in trouble, the cat would eyeball the owner and say, yeah, I did it. What are you going to do about it? But dogs and cats are different. And so the dogs, they kind of know they're in trouble. And so I saw one recently that went and literally stood with its head against the wall because it kind of was on time out, so to speak. Well, what we know here is that Israel hasn't been, or Judah, sorry, the southern kingdom, hasn't been faithful. They haven't been doing some of the things that God has asked them to do. And you might assume that if they were a dog, they would go and hide in the corner. But the writer of Lamentations, the writer sitting there watching his city and temple and family in flames, up in flames, that writer calls to mind God's compassion, and it brings him home. Listen to what it says. It says, "Yet I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. His compassions never fail, for they are new every morning." So to a man sitting, watching his city go into captivity, watching his temple ransacked, watching the items of the temple be hauled off, to that person he calls to mind God's compassion. And as he calls to mind God's compassion, hope starts to rise in him. Think of examples in the Bible for a moment. Moses kills an Egyptian and flees, and yet God in his compassion calls him back. Think of even before that, Cain kills Abel. And what does God do? God marks Cain so that he is protected as he leaves the garden. Think of David, who has an affair with Bathsheba and kills her husband. And yet God hears David's cry for forgiveness and in compassion forgives him. Or think of the woman who's caught in adultery. The only person who could have cast that stone, the only person who could have said to her, "Right, I'm going to take you and I'm going to throw this stone at you," the only person in Jesus turns to her and in compassion says, "I forgive your sins, go and sin no more." Or think, for example, of a thief on the cross who cries out to Jesus and says, can I find forgiveness? And Jesus has compassion on him and offers him forgiveness. And of course, if you've been a follower of Jesus longer than about that long, you will be able to tell examples of God's compassion given towards you. I mean, in preparation for today, I started to think about it, and to be honest, I didn't have to think very hard or very long to think of a number of examples of God's compassion being shown towards me. I want you to hear something very carefully. God is compassionate towards you. Now, I want to say it again, and I want to say it even slower so it sinks in. God is compassionate towards you. Just allow that statement to wash over for you for a moment. God is compassionate towards you. And I love how the writer of Lamentations goes on from that point to say, in fact, not only is God compassionate to you, but his compassions are new every morning. It's kind of like you have unlimited compassions today, and then tomorrow they're unlimited again. It's like every day that the earth revolves around the sun, every day that you wake up, every day that the sun in a sense rises, every day, the writer of Lamentations says, God is newly compassionate towards you. His compassions start again. So how do you call to mind these? What are these things that you call to mind to bring hope in the midst of trouble? Well, firstly, you remember God's great, steadfast, sacrificial love. Secondly, you call to mind his great compassion that is new every morning. And lastly, you call to mind God's faithfulness. If you're watching this with others, just have a look around and have a look at who you're doing this with. If you're watching it by yourself, pull to mind a couple of friends that you kind of consider. Just bring them to your mind for a moment. Now my guess is this. The people that you just remembered or you just looked at, they're better than you at some things. But my guess is you'll be better than them at others. In fact, I could go as far to say some of them might not be able to do something that you can do, but you might not be able to do something that they can do. And that's okay, because in a sense we're all different. We all can do some things and not do other things. But it feels sort of strange to say, but God's a bit like that. There's so much, of course, that God can do. I mean, he's all powerful, loving, kind, and all of these things that we know. He's so much bigger and wiser than we are. But there are some things that God cannot do. Now, it almost feels wrong saying that, doesn't it? That there are some things that God cannot do. But one of the things that God cannot do is that he cannot lie. In the book of Hebrews, in chapter 6, they're recounting the call of Abraham and God's call on Abraham's life. And in it, they're talking about this time that God made a covenant with Abraham. Listen to how part of it is from Hebrews chapter 6. When God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself. He confirmed it with an oath. God did this so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, that we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. So that passage says God makes a promise, and because God is number one, in a sense, he's the biggest and strongest, he doesn't make an oath by somebody else. He doesn't say on so-and-so or on such and such. He just says, by myself, I make this oath. But it goes on to say, but we should be encouraged, we should find encouragement from the fact that when God makes a promise, he cannot lie. He has to be faithful. God is different than us. I can choose to not lie, or I can choose to lie. God cannot choose to lie. It's just, he cannot go against his nature. He cannot do it. And so therefore, in Lamentations chapter 3, it says, "They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness, God." See, the writer looks back and he says, well, there's this love and there's this compassion, but can God be trusted to give us those things? And he says, well, yes, he can, because great is his faithfulness. In other words, God can't say something and then not do it. God can't make a promise to say, well, if you do these things, you'll find love and compassion from me, and then not do it, because that would make God a liar. And Hebrews reminds us that God cannot. He cannot lie. And so to the writer sitting with his head in his hands, the temple, the city destroyed, taken into captivity, families ripped apart, all of those things, he calls to mind God's faithfulness, and it brings hope. I mean, think about God's faithfulness in the scriptures for a moment. God promises exit from Egypt, and God's people do. God promises the Messiah to come, and he does. God promises the coming of the Holy Spirit, and it does. And so many more things. But think about God's faithfulness for a moment in the lives of others that you know. All of us could share a testimony of somebody that we know who would testify so strongly to God's faithfulness through the journey of life, and even through the most difficult parts of that journey. Or even our own selves, we could give examples of God's faithfulness to us again and again and again. That is why the writer of Lamentations can finish the little passage that we read with these words, "Therefore I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him." So, how do we finish? Hard times are hard. And grief and lament is real. And in no way am I saying you shouldn't grieve. In no way am I saying that at all. Listen to how Psalm 56 writes it in the Message translation. It says, You've kept track of my every toss and turn through sleepless nights. Each tear entered into your ledger, each ache written in your book. And so for those of you that are tearful or restless at night or who are aching for something, there is this beautiful promise in Psalm 56 as translated in the Message. It says, God takes all of that and he puts it in his book. It's not forgotten by him. It's not unseen by him. And one writer who is commenting on Lamentations chapter 3, and he mentions Psalm 56, he writes it like this: even in the era of the gospel, the same thing occasionally occurs. Then the broken-hearted who turn to these laments discover that they are not the first to pass through the thick darkness before emerging into sunlight again. So they realise that their God is the one who puts their tears into a scroll. Just this beautiful moment of remembering that God sees that grief and it's okay. But Paul encourages us in 1 Thessalonians to not grieve as those who have no hope. In other words, we're fine to grieve. It's just we want to grieve with this idea that there's a hope. We want to call some things to mind so that even in our grief, we can find hope. So I want to finish today with a picture. You've remembered that your car's on level 4, and so you've got into the elevators and you've pressed 4 and you go up and the doors of the elevator open. And it's as if at that moment the writer of Lamentations says to you, you've got two choices here. You can step out of the doors to the elevator and turn left. And in turning left, you can focus on hardship and despair and despondency and go downhill. Or you can focus right, you can turn right and you can call to mind God's great love for you that's not dependent on how you're acting or who you are. You can call to mind his great compassion shown to you, and you can call to mind his great faithfulness through all generations. And in so doing, as you call them to mind, instead of heading downhill, your hope can start to rise. And so we say to ourselves, the Lord is my portion. Therefore I will wait for him. So I encourage you this week to come out of the elevator, don't turn left and look to despair and despondency and the troubles that you face. Turn right. Consider again, call to mind daily God's love, steadfast, sacrificial, selfless love for you. God's compassions for you that are new every morning, and his faithfulness that was promised to see those promises be true in your life. God bless, and for those that can come, I look forward immensely to worshipping with you next week in our Sunday gatherings.